That was such an eye-opening conversation, especially when we talk about the complicatedness of access and legislation and the very delicate navigation of engaging with governments and engaging with non-state armed groups. Wonderful, wonderful conversation, and my thanks to Mr. Delitro. Our next panel is on ensuring continuity of education in zones of conflict. Our speakers for this panel are Her Excellency, Ms. Marina Sereni, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, Italy. Our next panelist is Her Excellency, Dr. Pauline Nalova Nyonga, Minister of Secondary Education, Cameroon. We will also be hearing from Dr. Andreas Snydel, Senior Program Officer, United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. We'll hear from Ms. Charlotte Berquin, Education Officer, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Regional Bureau for West and Central Africa. We'll hear from Ms. Inger Ashing, Chief Executive Officer, Save the Children International. And here present with us is Mr. Graham Lang, Chief of Education, Education Cannot Wait. Please come up. This panel will be moderated by Ms. Cathrine Andersen, Special Representative for Protection of Civilians, Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ms. Andersen? We can't hear you. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? I am unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Thank you. So thank you, Ms. Okbo, for the kind introduction, and it's a true pleasure to be with you. And welcome to all participants, virtual and physical, to this panel to discuss the continuation of education in conflict zones. Our engagement to protect education and to ensure safe access to education is accompanied by investing in the provision of education in conflicts. And I'm looking forward to discussing this with our distinguished speakers and invite you all to take part in the discussion during our Q&A session. Throughout the next hour and a half, we will dig into some of the challenges and solutions of how safe education can be delivered in situations where there is a risk of attacks on education and other grave violations against children and youth. We will also discuss the global pandemic and how it has affected continuity of education in conflict zones and what lessons we can take forward. I hope this discussion today will contribute with new perspectives and insights that we can take with us in our continued efforts to protect education from attack. I will first invite all of the panelists to provide an opening remark and follow up with a few specific questions before we move on to the Q&A. We will invite you, the participants, both virtually and physically, to ask questions to the panel. So let us get started. Italy is a champion for the Safe Schools Declaration and has, over the last years, had an emphasis on how to implement the declaration and how this can contribute to the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Italy has launched its own national action plan on women, peace and security, and I'm therefore delighted to kick off this discussion with a video intervention from Marina Sereni, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Italy. Please go ahead.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to intervene in the 4th edition of the Safe Schools Conference, and in particular in this panel dedicated to ensuring the continuity of education in zones of conflict. This year, we celebrate the 6th anniversary of the Safe Schools Declaration, a landmark document which in a short period of time has become a reference point to strengthen the respect of international humanitarian law and the rights of the children. We strongly support it, and we urge all countries to endorse and fully implement it. Let me first of all thank the government of Nigeria and the Global Coalition to Protect Education Under Attack for organizing this event, together with Argentina, Norway, and Spain. As the Safe Schools Declaration states, attacks to students and teachers, as well as against schools in situations of armed conflict, are prohibited under international law. Beyond this, we are convinced that continued access to schools, also in the context of enduring conflicts, is a powerful instrument to promote peace and provide opportunities for young people. COVID-19 pandemic further aggravated the situation with the closure of educational facilities all over the world. Among all children affected by armed conflict, girl children are more exposed to specific risks of violations and abuses and other harsh forms of violence, as well as to drop out of education, thus drastically undermining their chances of a better future. A gender perspective to this topic is indeed necessary. This is why we decided to pay specific attention to children, particularly girls, also in the implementation of the new Italian National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. The plan for the term 2020-2024 was adopted in light of the 25th anniversary of the Fourth World Conference of Women of Beijing and within the framework of the 20th anniversary of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325. Let me recall the 3 P's of WPS agenda: prevention, protection, and participation. We have mainstreamed the reference to children and in particular girls within the entire framework of the plan, considering Italy's specific commitment on children involved in armed conflict. We have also believed that in fragile environment, peacekeepers can play a crucial role in protecting civil infrastructures, including all educational facilities and the concerned civilian populations. Recent research shows that where peacekeeping operations are deployed, enrollment rates in school among girls have improved. In addition, Italy strongly believes in the benefits provided by the presence of well-integrated women personnel among peacekeeping troops, as this helps in accessing community and creating relationships of trust with local populations, in particular with those who are in the most vulnerable situations, including children. We are pleased that this conference, for the first time, takes place in an African country. We believe this can bolster the efforts to improve the conditions of children in this continent, including those living in zones affected by armed conflict or in fragile contexts. Children protection and access to education are central themes of the action of the Italian development cooperation. In the African continent, we promote several projects focused on these issues. We will continue working for the universal endorsement of the Safe Schools Declaration and, above all, to end violations and abuses against children in conflict. This is a moral imperative as well as an essential tool to promote future peace and to prevent further wars. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Sereni, for that message and for Italy's strong commitment to the Safe Schools Declaration and to moving from commitment to practice. I'm now very pleased to pass the floor to Dr. Lynn Nalowo-Liunga, the Secondary Education Minister from Cameroon. Welcome. Could you tell us about your government's work to implement the Safe Schools Declaration and how the Ministry of Secondary Education has played a role to support education during conflict? Vous avez la parole.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Again, like my other participants, I'd like to say thank you to Nigeria for undertaking the role of planning this conference. It is a very important conference, especially for Cameroon, because I think that Cameroon is a real big field for all the experiences of violence and the protection of schools. For one thing, I'd like to say that the insecurity perpetrated by the followers of Boko Haram, the Boko Haram sect in the far north region and neighboring Nigeria, that in the northwest and southwest regions, and to a lesser extent in Central African Republic, have caused us a great distress as far as education is concerned. So that is a real problem at the beginning. And then, come to add to it, we have the health crisis. And this time we're talking about COVID-19 that caused the government to order certain measures that the schools had to implement. We had to close schools. At this time, schools were, at the time that the pandemic hit us, we had to close schools completely. And the point was, could we close schools, have a blank year in Cameroon? No, we said. We said we had to continue education. To enable students to continue their education in the face of this crisis, instructions were given to school principals to accommodate displaced students from the conflicts, those who were running away from the conflicts within Cameroon in the northwest and southwest region. Didactic materials had to be given, books, notebooks, ballpoint pens, ordinary pencils, etc., were distributed to IDP. By IDP, we mean internally displaced students. If they ran to other areas of Cameroon, we had to give them admission to schools. It should be noted that in their flight, the parents of these students have lost almost everything and no longer have the means to meet the schooling needs of their children. Though a bilingual school was created and opened in Menawa refugee camp, to allow Nigerian refugees to continue their studies since they did not have the same system as Cameroon. Central African and other refugees are enrolled in the same schools as Cameroonians after a test to identify their level of study. Psychosocial support, we decided to use that to provide internal displaced students and refugees by guidance counselors. This was done by guidance counselors. During the period of temporary closure of schools due to COVID-19, lessons were organized over radio and television. A distance education was also created and opened in Yaoundé for the first time for secondary school students. And we had the digitalization of lessons, the broadcasting of live courses, the consultation of courses by pupils at any time, the follow-up of students in preparation for their official end-of-year exams. This organization, coupled with the reopening of schools, we had to convince the government that we could reopen the schools and that we were going to observe certain measures for distanciation and ensure that the schools are safe. And so that was done. And what we had was interesting to find that today, Cameroon has made a lot of progress in the digitalization of learning. COVID-19 provided an opportunity to make major investments in digital learning. And I'm proud to say that secondary school students are taking online courses, including pre-recorded ones, and receive coaching in preparation for their official exams. This new way of coaching students improves the quality of learning and the results in official exams. For example, the success rate for the brevet d'études du premier cercle BPC examination rose from 61.2% in the June 2019 session to 74.4% in the June 2020 session. The success rate for the Certificat d'aptitude professionnelle, sciences et technologies du territoire rose from 46.7% in 2019 to 59.6% in 2020. The success rate for baccalaureate in general secondary schools increased from 39.6% in 2019 to 73.6% in 2020, while the baccalaureate GCPEA level technical secondary schools increased from 68.7% in 2019 to 76.6% in 2020, to mention only these few. And we're going to see what will happen during this academic year. With the progress made in distance learning, it is clear that secondary school students in Cameroon and even in other countries will continue to benefit from the services of this established center, even after the end of COVID-19 and the insecurity in Cameroon. Today, this distance education center is a tool for improvement in the quality of education that complements traditional learning through the use of online and offline resources. In this regard, tablets are also provided to students to enable them to benefit from these services. And we must thank those who have been giving tablets to the students, but the government has to put in more money for these equipment. With the distance education center, even students who are out of the school system can be taught using tablets, especially those in the Northwest and Southwest regions where most of the schools are closed due to insecurity. The Distance Education Center is a vector for the continuation of education and for the protection of students and teachers in times of crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, the point that I really want to make here is the fact that we are thankful to the government for joining in with the Ministry of Secondary Education to give more resources to the students. But those resources are not enough. And I must make the point here that we need to protect the schools even further. The safe school concept, I think it's a very interesting concept, because so long as the schools go on and so long as armed conflict is on, these areas will still become the targets for those who have arms. And for the first time, we're seeing that the killing of children, the killing of women has become a definite policy for those who are carrying out armed conflicts. And everybody is surprised to see the violence that occurs for those people who have arms to fight civilians. This is a very important forum. I'm so thankful that the Nigerians are doing it. We have to see, how do we keep the schools safe? I think safe school and school premises have a special status which we must protect and make sure that it continues. And how do we make sure that it continues? Who actually controls the arms that makes it possible that schools become the target for armed conflict? If there is a government that is in place, let that government be supported. And the armed conflict should not be given the opportunity for them to attack schools, for them to attack women, for them to attack children. It's a very stupid policy on the part of those who have arms. Thank you very much for giving me the possibility to intervene.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Lienga, and thank you for that call to parties in conflict to take their responsibility and to protect education and children, youth, trying to improve their situation and their future by getting an education. I was particularly interested to hear about your efforts to include displaced children, and it underlines the importance of the role of ministries of education in this work. In the community of states that have endorsed the declaration, we often talk about the importance of collaboration across ministries. We need to have ministries of education engaged. I think it's proven by your intervention here. And in your view, what steps could we take to ensure more active engagement from ministries of education across the 112 states that have endorsed the declaration?
I think we need to sensitize the government and the population on the importance of safe school, because actually, although this has existed a few years back, but people do not actually know the concept of a safe school, and particularly in Cameroon, because you have so many different groups. The diversity in Cameroon has to be managed. We have linguistic diversity, so many languages in one place, and then so many languages between the two halves of the country. You have the French speaking, and you have the English speaking. And then, of course, you have the indigenous languages. People should not look at this as a problem, but should look at it as something which will help to save the new community of the 21st century, because there is diversity everywhere, but must diversity be looked at as a problem? And I think that interministerial collaboration is so important. And I'm talking about sensitization because one of the things is that if I see a place where the funding for education is reduced as opposed to where we were last year, I think that is a problem. That's a problem because there is no real sensitization on the fact that once you have school comes back, okay, we have had school is going on, we have had improvements in the results of education, but it cannot end there because the armed conflict people will still attack the schools unless we do something. Therefore, we have to increase the budgets. And as you use distance education to improve the participation of children and protect continuation of education, the funding must increase, because with distance education, you're talking about equipment, you're talking about internet, you're talking about all those things that you did not have before. Therefore, that sensitivity must be done so that other ministries see education as a special feature that needs, as I said, special status and must be protected.
Thank you very much, and thank you for sharing your experience on how to continue education both during the pandemic but also during conflict, and your points about education being a tool for also managing diversity as a resource was very interesting. I'm sure we will touch upon some of the issues you have raised during the question and answer session as well. We will move now to our next speaker, and we often focus in how we speak about the Safe Schools Declaration on schools and on child protection. However, over the last years, attacks on higher education have been on the rise, and the risk and violence affecting youth is being reported. And Dr. Snilldal from UNESCO, in your opinion, what could be done to increase our awareness on attacks on higher education? What can we do to minimize these attacks and to better protect students and teachers also in these educational institutions?
Thank you, Cathrine, and thank you. I wish to thank the organizer for highlighting the importance of protecting higher education from attack, and also for inviting UNESCO to speak on this topic. As you know, UNESCO is the lead agency for SDG 4 on equitable and inclusive education for all. And it is also the only UN agency with a mandate in higher education. And UNESCO has a special responsibility to promote the continuity of higher education in zones of conflict. So let me start by underlining the crucial role of universities in societies beyond their mission to provide study programs. In fact, through research and development of new knowledge, universities are not only important agents for achieving SDG 4, but they are also arguably the only entity in society that contributes to the fulfillment of all the SDGs. And the impact of university closures therefore reach far beyond the already immense costs of students being forced to interrupt their studies, or the cost of rebuilding campuses, labs, and libraries. Attacks on higher education can do irreparable damage to society. Through the implementation and monitoring of normative instruments such as the 1997 recommendation concerning the status of higher education teaching personnel, UNESCO supports national governments in protecting higher education institutions from threats to their autonomy by offering policy advice and capacity building, and by strengthening their systems to provide equitable and quality education in emergencies. And for the same reason, UNESCO is dedicating a special segment on higher education in emergencies at the Third World Conference on Higher Education, taking place in Barcelona in May next year. The COVID-19 pandemic has provoked an unprecedented use of distant learning, also in higher education, and has opened possibilities for high learning that we could not even dream about just a few years ago. However, this and the use of technology does not free us from the obligation to protect the physical integrity of higher education institutions in conflict zones. For many study fields, such as most of the natural and health sciences, the use of laboratories in teaching is indispensable, while quality research often depends on complex infrastructure and costly equipment, which can take generations to reconstruct. And let us not forget the importance of university administrations in ensuring the smooth running and quality of study programs, and also their roles as custodians of irreplaceable records and documentation. Because lack of documentation of qualifications is one of the most important barriers preventing refugee students from continuing their studies. And diplomas issued in zones of conflicts are the object of extra scrutiny in receiving countries. Not only is the status and accreditation of universities in conflict zones often questioned, there are usually also a surge in diploma frauds in such situations. This can have very serious consequences for students. Because the moment a university is forced to close, the possibility of verifying the authenticity of diplomas also disappear, thus affecting not only all active students, but also the totality of former students. In other cases, contacting higher education institutions for verification of refugees' diplomas can pose a threat to their security. These are some of the reasons why UNESCO has launched a qualifications passport for refugees and vulnerable migrants to ensure the recognition of their higher education qualifications, even when documentary evidence is lacking or when verification of diploma is no longer possible due to university closures. In this way, students being forced to flee from zones of conflict have an opportunity to continue their studies and one day perhaps also contribute to the rebuilding of their home societies. And I think I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to answer questions. And thank you again to the organizers and for letting UNESCO address this forum here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Snilldal. I think you have emphasized the crucial role of universities and higher education for society, for cultural heritage, and for the development of different sectors and the communities. I think what you also pointed out is how distance learning has given us many opportunities, but that it cannot replace the sort of physical learning, including the protective environment, safe education facilities give us. Many of the attacks on higher education are specifically linked to detention, persecution of students and teaching personnel. So the attacks have a little bit of a different character than some of the other patterns of attack that we see on education. How can we address this issue more broadly, and in particular when we try to use the Safe Schools Declaration as a tool to protect also higher education?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and I think in conflict situations and war, students and university professors are among the first groups to flee. And I think we need to put more emphasis on their importance in society beyond the conflict situation for the future of the country. And I think we need to push countries more in that direction and make them more aware of the role of higher education. For instance, through in the international community, in the discussions on education in emergencies, there hasn't been that much focus on higher education in emergencies, but I think would be the time to address now, because we're seeing conflicts, ongoing conflicts, where this turns out to be extremely present, and it will only be more and more present in years to come, I think. So I think now the time has to come to also address higher education and the role of teaching personnel, the role of students, not only as receivers of education, but also as actors in society and the future of countries.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we will come back to some of these issues during the question and answer session. For the next few speakers, we will try to look at more practical examples of how education is protected and provided in conflict zones. I will start with Ms. Charlotte Bergin from UNHCR, who is working in Western and Central Africa. And Ms. Bergin, could you share some examples of how you work on this issue in the region with the displaced people, and how the Safe Schools Declaration is a tool in your work?
Oui, bonjour, merci Catherine. Tout d'abord, il est important de considérer que les 4,5 millions d'enfants réfugiés et déplacés internes
displaced, now displaced people in West Africa, West and Central Africa, it's the same school that the children are attending. Therefore, they have to have access to the same kind of opportunities inside school and outside of school. In West and Central Africa, these are various regions that are touched by attack on education. There are a lot of conferences where we have shown that there is an increasing rate of attacks on schools. There are also violence. Many countries are touched by this, and of course that causes displaced persons. For example, we can see more than 30% of refugees and more than 43%. The fear and closing of schools continue based on the attack on schools. Schools have become, in fact, overcrowded also. In West and Central Africa, there are about 40 million of children that are out of school before the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, there are a lot of adults that are affected. For refugee children, of course, the figures are more dramatic, because during the 2021 school year, more than 60% have not been able to go to school, and only 15% were able to go to school. We also have to take into account children that are faced in displaced issues. Mechanisms for protection that exist at the community are not enough. Therefore, of course, they face famine in their community, and they need to be protected, and so that they don't find themselves in forced labor, of course, exploitation. There are risks of sexual violence, denial of access to education are more important in a displaced situation. That is why we think that peace education in school is the best means to protect these children that are becoming vulnerable because of the displacement. As a member of the coalition to protect education against attacks and as protection for all the children that are displaced, we try to do everything to ensure return to school. Of course, we strengthen the capacity of the various schools in various zones that have a lot of displaced persons. There are measures also to prevent attack on education, rehabilitation, security, safe schools, early warning system, and training of education personnel, etc. These are various measures that were taken and then also want to ensure the continuation of taking care of refugee children and taking alternative ways, distance learning, accelerated education program, and other opportunities for professional training for children that are not in school. Mrs. Lariga had talked about education through radio that were used in Cameroon during the pandemic period. Another expert also distributed more than 11,000 radios to children in Burkina Faso and Cameroon, Mali, where they have access to learning, distance learning, which has been pronounced by various institutions to ensure access to education and learning of skills by making promotion of an environment that is safe to learn at all levels, including very free education, integration, psychosocial support, of protection of the children, professor of the center, in order to give access to children, and well-being and the condition of learning are also made favorable for all the children. Another point that is important is to distribute how to support the teachers, because they are the first in quality education and protection for all the children. Therefore, we cannot talk about only asking children to do their work without, of course, tools and without accompanying them specifically because of what they need to carry out their work. Finally, I want to recall that education is very essential for sustainable solutions, particularly in conflict period. Therefore, it must be better integrated in humanitarian support, and that all the children are allowed to go to school during this conflict period, particularly in this region. What is also more serious is the effect of the children not going to school. Therefore, the necessity, as Madam Lariga has said, of course, the need to support the teachers and to give support to children and the youth so that education can play a role of protection and solution. Thank you. Thank you also.
Thank you very much for this. It's I think you've laid out how really the closure of schools is a driver for displacement, and that the continued closure of schools prevents returns. So it's really a close linkage here between displacement and the fact that there is no safe access to education. You also pointed out the need to maintain the teaching staff and to protect the teaching staff. And could you maybe give examples of how you have experience of doing that, how you are able to retain, what we can do to retain staff in these situations, and how these experiences that you have from the region can be relevant for other contexts?
Merci.
Thank you to come back to this point concerning teachers, because I think that is something that is very important for the continuation of education. We have done a lot. The maximum we can do to protect schools and infrastructure, if we haven't got enough teachers qualified and that are also protected in various schools, particularly at the schools where we have refugee children in West and Central Africa and regions that are overwhelmed by these vulnerable children. And to give a very concrete example, for instance, in the region, during the last school year, the UNHCR, of course, support more than 2,000 teachers in the conflict zones in order to let these children to remain in their place, and then also provide them enough accommodation in the regions where they can go so that they will not be dangerous transporting in a regular manner. Therefore, apart from only giving them salary, they have to find them to have conditions of life in the area in order to carry out their work in safety. Of course, there's also the issue of training, the continuing training of teachers. UNHCR has trained more than 2,500 teachers in the region in education in emergency protection of the children, support, social support in order to improve them to take care of the children and also the teaching of refugee children. I want to end by saying also that it's very essential that, of course, policies that are developed by the ministry and the government should take into account the dimension of crises and plan for that. If we have to add in emergency in when there's displaced persons, the policies should take into account that there should be some mechanism for emergency deployment. There should be a mechanism for training, accelerated training for teachers, and there should be a mechanism to enable the teachers to be able to be protected even when they are teaching in crisis situations. Thank you.
I think this is a point that we may bring into the Q&A session as well, how you are describing the need for education policies to take crisis and conflicts into account and plan for that, and have policies that include these elements. I would like to move now to Ms. Ashing from Save the Children International. The colleague from UNHCR, I think, and the other colleagues as well, have described quite extensively the kind of risks and violations that children and youth are exposed to when education is not safe, when schools are not safe. And one important aspect of the Safe Schools Declaration framework is to try to address these issues. So from Save International, what is your take on this? And what examples have you seen in your work in Save the Children to address this issue?
Thank you for that question. And I first want to thank the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack for their efforts in organizing this important conference and for convening the panel today. At Save the Children, we see an undeniable connection between efforts that enable children to continue their education in times of crisis and the reduction in grave violations against children's rights. So we see that very clearly. And we know that when children are out of school, they are much more vulnerable to a host of risks, more vulnerable to abduction, to child labor, to child marriage, and of course, recruitment to armed groups, which I know is a real concern in the region. New research that we compiled on children's recruitment by armed groups in Sahel found that most of the recruited children had either dropped out of school or had not had access to school systems prior to their recruitment. So it is not being in school is a risk, and being in school is a protection. And this is particularly worrying in a region where the number of schools closed as a result of violence across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger increased sevenfold from April 2077 to July 2021. Nearly 4,000 schools across the three countries remain closed due to insecurity, affecting over 700,000 children. And 2 weeks ago, I was in Burkina Faso and saw firsthand the consequences of school closures and the negative impact it has for children. And we heard Charlotte Begwin speaking passionately about it as well. But I also saw how we can change this negative impact and turn it into a positive outcome when we give children access to education. Just to share a couple of examples, and I want to focus on girls particularly, because we know that girls are particularly vulnerable in these situations, and they are particularly vulnerable to sexual violence. One 14-year-old girl told us about her school closure, and she said, "I'm worried about my learning. I have a fear of teenage pregnancy and child marriage. Schoolgirls are the most targeted ones in marriage due to school closure." And I have spoken to a number of young girls telling me exactly the same thing, that being out of school is a real risk, and that they are worried for themselves and their friends, and being forced into child marriages and not being able to conclude and finalize their education. And these are just some of the threats to their rights and what children face when schools are closed. And over the past 18 months, we have collectively borne witness to the impact of unprecedented school closures on children. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, Save the Children has worked with partners, children, parents, and communities to respond to children's needs and to deliver programs to ensure that their education can continue. We have done so by creating new ways of working to ensure effective distance learning programs that keep children safe and engaged in education, to support their well-being and to help prepare for their safe return to school. But as you can imagine, this is very challenging in many areas of the world due to lack of connectivity, etc. So we have to be really innovative and find new ways of both digital and manual distance learning. And while we know that we must continue to find effective ways to support children struggling to access school, the opportunity to learn and develop, there is no substitute for the role of safe schools and the classroom in protecting children. Efforts to ensure children stay in school in the shadow of COVID-19 and against the backdrop of man-made conflicts are crucial for their protection. In contexts where education is under attack, Save the Children has pioneered an integrated program to support children, their communities, and governments to protect children's rights to learn and to be safe. Our Safe Schools programming takes an all hazards approach, meaning that we stand ready to respond to threats children face in and around school due to conflict, violence, and natural and everyday hazards and new risks posed by COVID-19. And we work with children, school management, and local communities in countries such as DRC, South Sudan, Nigeria, Ukraine, Nigeria, Syria, and the OPT to secure protective learning environments, to raise awareness among communities, and to build local and national level engagement to protect education. The program has child participation at its heart and was developed as a practical contribution to meeting the goals of the Safe School Declaration. Alongside engaging children and communities in their protection of their own schools, the program contributes to a preventive approach, ensuring that, where possible, schools can stay safely open for children throughout times of insecurity. Unfortunately, we know too well that once children are out of school, it is often hard for them to find their way back. And we see millions of children at the risk of never returning to school, so this is a crucial time for us to act. The Safe School Declaration have been effective in encouraging commitments to protect education by national authorities, and we all know that we must work together at all levels to ensure that those commitments translate to change for children on the ground. It is absolutely about committing to the declaration, but equally important is to make sure that it is implemented. And through combining national and international policy efforts with programs such as Schools as Students of Peace, and other programs to ensure children are able to safely continue their education in conflict, we can translate commitments into action. And together we can work to ensure children across the world are able to be safe at school where they belong, thereby reducing the risk they face to grave violations of their rights and giving them their best hope for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Time is running fast, but I really appreciate you highlighting the protective environment of safe schools and also your underlining of how community engagement is key for protecting schools, and also how child participation is key. To ensure that we have some time for Q&A, I think I will move to, in this round, to our final speaker, Mr. Lang from Education Cannot Wait. I think the previous speakers have really highlighted the importance of ensuring the continuation of education. Could you share some of the successes and challenges that Education Cannot Wait has faced when implementing programs to ensure the continuity of education? Mr.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I hope my sound is okay. You can hear me. I have 2 microphones, so I hope that's all right. It's always a bit tricky going last because many of the comments perhaps have already been made, but nice to see perhaps some consensus around some of the points that I'm going to make. For those of you that don't know Education Cannot Wait, we are the UN fund dedicated specifically to education in emergencies and protracted crises. We came out of the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016. As a fund, we don't implement anything. We rely on our partners, for example, UN agencies such as UNHCR, international NGOs such as Save the Children, and their local civil society partners to do the implementation on the ground. But whilst we're a fund, we're also very much a movement, trying to reposition education. Can you hear me? All right. Yeah, good. Trying to reposition education from the margins of the humanitarian response to right at the center, along with other life-saving interventions such as health and food security. And at the same time, advocating for the link between these humanitarian responses and the longer-term development efforts that Charlotte actually referred to earlier. In this spirit of a movement, this is why we're a donor to the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. And the reason that we made the commitment to send me here today to be physically present at this conference on behalf of Education Cannot Wait, because we see the importance of the work that they are doing, and particularly around all the efforts on the Safe Schools Declaration. So just quickly, since our inception, and very much thanks to our donor partners, particularly, for example, thank you to Norway, we have raised over $800 million. We have reached, our partners have reached over 4.6 million children across 40 countries. Our accelerated response times, so weeks rather than months, our focus on coordination, joint planning, holistic approaches to education, as well as flexible multi-year financing for these protracted crises, and our commitment to raise more money for these emergencies and these protracted crises are very much the hallmarks of our success thus far. But coming, I think, very quickly, and I've got 3 challenges that I just wanted to cover, Catherine. The first one is in relation to, and we've talked a lot about it, but it's situations where schools are being used as weapons. And we had a very interesting discussion earlier on this morning about the engagement with non-state armed groups. And I think particularly where schools are being used as weapons to displace, to threaten communities, to liberate land and get access to resources. It's something that we're seeing a lot, particularly in the Sahel. And these attacks result in thousands of school closures. And they also, in the long term, they result in higher dropout rates, particularly disproportionately for girls, because of the fear that brings with being associated with an educational establishment. So, we've got more children out of school in West and Central Africa than we had 10 years ago. And a large part of this is due to attacks on education. I appreciate the work is ongoing, as we saw this morning with these state armed groups. But the challenge is, how do we protect children in situations where actually just being physically present in a school is dangerous? It's a threat to them. So that's a challenge, and I'll come on to some solutions. The second one, very quickly, is how do we reach those children who are furthest behind? And when I mention that, I really want to focus on children with disabilities. I think collectively, in these emergencies and protracted crises, we've been very good at reaching children who are in the system or who are on the peripheries of the system, but less so for these children who, if you like, are invisible, who are not in the system. And I think you could argue that on the one hand, the fact that they are not in the schools actually, strangely, provides them with some protection. But we can't, on the one hand, advocate for an inclusive education system to bring them into education, and on the other hand, not ensure that their safety and protection is assured in situations where schools are under attack. So the question there is, how do we make sure that for these most vulnerable learners, these schools are safe places to learn? And lastly, just on, and several speakers, including the Excellency Minister of Education from Cameroon and you, Charlotte, mentioned this, the issue of the impact of psychosocial the impact of the attacks on education and the mental health and psychosocial state of children in these contexts. I mean, we know that without education, children are deprived from their physical, socio-emotional and psychological development. Long-term exposure to these sorts of high-stress situations leads to nightmares, flashbacks, really crippling grief, and can have long-term damaging impacts on the physical and mental health of children and young people. In Central Sahel, according to a recent report released this week, in fact, by the Norwegian Refugee Council, over half the children in Central Sahel don't feel safe in schools. It's not a safe space for them to go. And over 60% of them have no hope for the future, and have real trouble completing their schooling. And so psychosocial support is a real fundamental precursor for learning and for development of children and adolescents. So just very quickly, I want to end on perhaps some solutions. Don't want to end on the doom and gloom. We have to remain positive, and I think we do have some positive potential solutions. Firstly, coming out of COVID, I think whilst that had a devastating impact, without a shadow of a doubt, on education systems globally, I think there have been some positive developments, some innovative approaches to continuing education in situations where being physically present was not possible. And I think we can capitalize on those moving forward, and we have mentioned them already this morning. Some speakers, we have already talked about these age-appropriate, relevant, accelerated education programs, which can be used to catch up on time that has been lost due to disruption, and also low-tech distance education. And I emphasize low-tech, particularly in situations that we support where there is just not that physical infrastructure. On the last the last point around practical actions, and I come back to the opening comments in yesterday's opening session about pragmatic solutions to some of these issues. I want to end on a couple of those. I think it's really important that in the design of the national level Safe Schools Declaration action plans, these aspects around provision for children and adolescents with disabilities and around this aspect of psychosocial support are embedded in those action plans. It's really important. I know they are already in some of them, but I think that should be something that's mainstream throughout. And lastly, on funding, and Your Excellency, Minister from Cameroon, you raised this point. It's really important that we can fund these action plans. It's really important that the funding is there. Now, education cannot wait. Our multi-year resilience program funding is flexible. If the action plans, if those actions can be costed and included in these multi-year resilience programs, we can then fund them. And we can fund those actions, and we can make a difference. And then we can use the money that we also raise through these programs to fund these actions. So I'll stop there and happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. This is very interesting. I think you have also pointed to some opportunities for investing in education in conflicts, including investing in the Safe Schools Declaration action plans. I think our colleague from Geneva Call this morning pointed out how they are working to change the behavior of parties to conflict. And I think to the first challenge that you pose, Graham, that is really an important area for us to step up our efforts. But then again, as we know that this is not solved easily, we need to continue also to work within the parameters that we have. And the Safe Schools Declaration, I think, looks particularly at military use that was discussed also in the panel yesterday. And I think this is really something that we need to keep our focus on, that there are some practical measures to be taken by parties to conflict in how the conflict is conducted. Now, we have had a question online from the audience, and it is directed to the Deputy Minister from Cameroon, Dr. Leonga, on how you see the plans in Cameroon for strengthening education in emergencies, and maybe particularly coming out of COVID. Is it an opportunity to, let's say, build back better using those experiences? Dr. Lyonga.
Okay. Dr. Lyonga is the Minister of Secondary Education. Okay. I think there is a lot of hope, but more could be done. There is hope in the sense that the at the political level, you know, there is anxiety to do much for the children. One of the things that I have to say is that the head of state of Cameroon, President Paul Biya himself, has given a lot of funds, a lot of funding is coming to Cameroon, excuse me, to the Ministry of Education, but which is not enough at all, because there is really no focus on the Safe School Declaration. The Safe School Declaration has to be studied as a concept, and as a concept which has certain norms that we should focus on. How do we continue keeping the schools safe? Is a question that we have to answer. And how do we, what kind of money do we have to keep all these schools? People who are running away from schools for good reasons, because there is no safety. When they come into the schools that are taking them in, they are busting on the seams. What do? We have to think about those schools. There are lots of aspects that we have to think of in order to permit the continuation of it. As when I say I'm hopeful because there is an understanding that actually there is something unsafe which is happening. The whole society is shocked to see that people can have it as a policy to kill young children, to kill the parents. Of course, when they kill the mothers, then what do you do with the children? The children are just as unsafe as anybody else. So we are quite happy that the people are a little bit becoming, sensitive to the fact that something must be done. But how does that sensitivity translate into money, into funding of these activities? Even getting internet, how do you get internet? How does communication become accessible to everybody who wants to use it in distance education? How do you keep off people who are not who are not in the army, but who are using who have some collaboration with the army? How do you use the fact that, how do you get some teachers who have collaboration with the armed people, because they have seen that with these arms there is money making? How do you dissuade this money making from coming in to have an influence on the education system? There's a lot that I think SSD needs to do for it to become into policy, and where we have to make governments sensible, sensitive, and international governments, if they are getting in collaboration with local governments. It should be the governments that are in power, and not those who are out and who are using guns that they have got from illegal means to frighten populations that don't have any means.
Thank you very much, Minister. We have a question also to Education Cannot Wait, to Graham Lang, on how Education Cannot Wait can contribute here to some of also the issues that the Minister was mentioning, the funding and of these action plans. And could you say something more about that, what the opportunities are for that?
Yeah, thank you very much. And it actually gives me a good opportunity to respond in particularly for example, on the case of Cameroon. As you know, Your Excellency, we're working with you and your government to develop a multi-year resilience program for the next 3 years, targeting the protracted crises in Cameroon. Now, this is a locally designed program. This is a program that responds to the government priorities. It responds to those national strategies. And my point, and it would be great to see that coming through in the development of this multi-year resilience program, is that the SSD, the relevant parts of the SSD action plan that require financing should be embedded in that multi-year resilience program. And that will then enable you to then use that funding to undertake those actions. That's an example specifically in Cameroon, but it applies to all the funding, the countries that we fund under these multi-year resilience programs. The funding is flexible, and it is there to respond to priorities, and should respond to that are costed at local levels, and which there is a need, and which Education Cannot Wait can finance.
Thank you. I think you point out also how the need for local context and local governance is key. For Save the Children, you now have experience with COVID, as also was described by the minister from Cameroon, different policies and different approaches. How can these experiences be used to build back better, to include maybe even children that have not been included so far, as Mr. Lang was pointing out, children with disabilities, for example, those that are really, let's say, in the hard to reach areas, really in some of the really hard, difficult, violent contexts. And how is Save the Children approaching this, and how are you working with governments on this?
Thank you for that question. I think the last few years have forced all of us to adapt to a new context because of the combined threats of COVID, conflict, but also climate change. I think that more than in any, and decades of progress have been are at threat or has been in reverse. So yes, of course, this is something that we think a lot about, and what we focus very much on when it comes to building forward better, because we think it's about creating something in the future that is better than we used to have. And if we talk about education, even before COVID, and even in areas like Western Central Africa, we had a huge number of children that weren't part of schools. So this is only worsening the situation. So it is very much about making sure that we are funding education in the future, to make sure that we have educational systems that are resilient. And we are working very closely with the governments in all the countries where we are present, in dialogue with them about what does that look like, and how can you have more resilient educational systems? How can you invest in that from a government perspective? And the positive thing is that in many countries there's a joint commitment from the governments, from the institutional donors, from all the local and international NGOs that we need to build forward better. So I think that there's a lot of progress. I guess the challenge is, as we heard Professor Uyonga say, is that in many countries is lack of resources, and even if the governments are really focusing on funding education, it's scarce, it's not enough. And the one thing that I really want to add is that regardless of what we do, what we cannot forget is to involve children in this forward-looking work, because they know best what they need, and we need to get them involved in the conversations. And I know that you heard a number of children giving witness yesterday, but leading up to this conference, we have more than 300 children that have shared their views with Save the Children. They have a very strong child manifesto that I encourage everyone to read, because there's a lot of examples there and clarity on what they think needs to happen.
Thank you very much. We are running very close to the end here. I wanted to ask our Mrs. Sopiki if there are any questions from Abuja, from the room, that you want us to take.
Would anybody in the room like to ask questions? We have space for just a couple more, I think. Do we have any questions in the room? We have our mics stationed, I believe. And if you... Any questions? Okay, I believe we have one question.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Hi, I'm Oliver Mulwini. I'm from the International Parliamentary Network for Education. We're a global network of parliamentarians working to achieve SDG 4. And we've worked very closely with the coalition in the build-up to this summit. It was really interesting to hear from the panel some of the challenges and solutions in terms of ensuring continuity of education during armed conflict. I was wondering if I could pose to our panelists what role community-based education can play in terms of reaching the furthest behind children, as well as kind of as a solution to some of those children who might be too fearful of going to school, or when obviously their school can't be accessed due to armed conflict. And I think one of the reasons why I asked this question is obviously with the change of regime in Afghanistan, and community-based education's historically played a really key role there, and might still be a solution in terms of providing education to girls in particular during the time of the Taliban's governance. So I was also wondering if there's any examples of best practice in terms of community-based education that our panelists can share. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. I think we will take this question with us into the sort of final round, where I'll let our speakers give their closing comments. But if we take with us the question of the role of community-based education, and also another question that we've had online is how Safe Schools Declaration states, those that have endorsed the declaration, that are not currently in conflict and that have experience of being able to include girls, other vulnerable groups like this children with disability. How can their experiences be used, and how can they support the implementation of the Safe Schools Declaration? I'll give the floor first to the Ministry of Education in Cameroon, Dr. Lynn.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Let me use Cameroon's example again first of all, school fees are waived for children with disabilities, and including those in insecure areas, and for the children born to disabled parents. So, which means that all these children have the opportunity to go to school, and steps are also being taken to integrate them into the construction of school buildings, to make sure that appropriate places are built for these children with disabilities. But I think that again, more has to be done to find out whether schools actually have the staff who can look after these children, because I have too many children who are complaining to me, whose parents have written for them to have, for them not to pay fees as the government has asked, but who are not having that ability. So I think the first thing of having this aspect of inclusive education is to ensure that these children do not pay fees. These fees are waived, and that is done systematically in every school, and it should be reported to the ministries so that there is a follow-up, because we have a system of doing it in one school or the other, and other schools are not doing it. But there must be follow-up for that to be done. And as far as community-based education is concerned, I have to tell those who will endorse the SSD method to make sure that community-based education is not infiltrated by non-state fighters, because this is what you're going to find. They're going to push in a curriculum that you don't want. But let it be that it is the state that is fueling the community-based education. And people should be working with schools that are well known, and the ministry should know what is actually being taught in the community schools. It's very important because today in the 21st century, everybody needs to be educated about a computer. I mean, every mother or person who is taking care of children at home should know how to help a child to put on a computer, follow up lessons, do that. So we ourselves, our parents, everybody who is at home, this educated community has to be a reality in order that SSD should move on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you for pointing out some of the risks and weaknesses of that, let's say, a community-based based approach, and also for the call to really systematically waive school fees for children with disabilities, and for pointing out also that for children in school there is more than teaching that is needed. There are a wide range of needs and that children need to have met in school. Thank you very much for your contribution to this discussion, Minister. Highly appreciate that. I would move on to Dr. Snilldal for a final comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I will just re-emphasize the special case of higher education when it comes to protecting education from attacks, namely the role of universities in societies for the development and the fulfillment of the SDGs, and also the importance of protecting the physical facilities for higher education, which of course makes alternatives like community-based learning less relevant for higher education. But of course then there are possibilities now greater than ever for distant learning through technology. And also let me reiterate the role of higher education teaching personnel in upholding democratic values and developing knowledge. And finally, the concern for protecting students in higher education students and ensuring the continuity of their learning, even if they're not able to stay and they're forced to flee abroad. And I think UNESCO would urge governments to grant protection to students, especially, and provide higher education opportunities for qualified students so they can also contribute to the reconstruction and the reopening of higher education institutions in their home countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Snilldal, and thank you for pointing out also the role of higher education more broadly in society for the development, but also for the post-conflict and reconstruction of areas that have experienced conflict. I would then like to move to Ms. Begin for a final comment.
Merci, Catherine. Je vais revenir sur.
I want to come back on some points that were raised that are very essential. The first one that was mentioned was that the COVID-19 pandemic made us to go and find how to support education. We have innovating solutions to ensure continuation of education, and that must continue and must be in fact amplified so that children should not be out of school because of attacks, and we should not forget all the children. We also have distance learning system should be reinforced or strengthened in order to ensure continuation of education for all. The question on the community-based education, I think that the essential role that can be played here by the community is to accompany them for learning at distance, and then also ensure that we have quality content, and also that need to be integrated. The education, community-based education has an essential role to play with all the approaches of protection and particularly of displaced persons. Secondly, I think that we are trying to strengthen the mechanism of monitoring and reporting of attacks on education at the international level. That should include also refugee children and displaced children, particularly schools in camps. The monitoring, once again, is necessary because it's the best way to plan and associate appropriate advocacy programming in order to have various answers to serious violations created in these. So the need for all the countries to ensure or sign the Safe School Declaration and to ensure that everyone in their territory is aware of that, particularly those dealing with displaced persons. Then it's also important to increase funding for education in emergency situations and also in crises, long-standing crises. A substantial financing of education is essential to contribute to improve security situation of schools. We need several increase or increment in order to ensure funding for development of education. It's also important to draw attention on education in emergency situations in intersectoral and multidisciplinary measures to be taken and the influence of the different actors in order to strengthen security and ensure the continuation of learning for all children in crisis situation. Finally, I want to say that the quality education is the best way to attack to the forced displacement. It is the key that will enable the development of the potential of all refugee and displaced children. Yesterday, someone mentioned Kofi Annan by saying education is skill building by another man, and that is very true in displaced situations. Thank you.
We're also linking this to education to peace building, and I think also some of the innovations and innovative approaches that all of the speakers in this panel have pointed to as a result of COVID-19 is also something that we will bring with us. Finally, Ms. Ashing from Save the Children for some final comments from you.
Thank you, Cathrine. And my fellow panelists have raised excellent points, so I will not repeat them, but I want to leave you with one or maybe two messages from my part. And it's clear from the interventions today that far-reaching and necessary work is underway to realize every child's right to access a safe education from their early years through to university. And I think it's great that we have looked at the whole educational system. And we also heard from the presentations by Ms. Sereni and Dr. Luyunga, which demonstrates what is possible when governments recognize the extraordinary potential of the Safe School Declaration and the agenda and take concrete and measurable steps to implement the declaration. And when leadership is combined with the efforts of donors, UN agencies, civil society, and most crucially, with that of affected children, teachers and communities, that there is much that we can achieve together. And that takes me to the point that I want to make. And as I said earlier, in the lead up to this conference, Save the Children consulted with 300 children in 10 conflict-affected countries to ask what they wanted the world to know about their experiences and their hopes for their education. And of course, it was critical to include all groups of children, including the most vulnerable in those conversations, but also in the recommendations. And in the response, the children worked together to draft a manifesto, a document which paints a stark picture of the daily reality of what it means to grow up in conflict, as children emphasize the fear that influence all parts of their lives. But the manifesto is a powerful and inspirational call to action. Because children do not want to be scared anymore. They want to live their dreams. They want to live their lives, being able to fulfill their dreams of having access to safe education, which they tell us mean friends, safety, and learning without limitations. And they are telling us exactly what we need to prioritize. They tell us that we need to make sure that they can get to and from school safely. They are asking us to stop people from entering schools and harming students. And critically, They want to be able to access the conversations and be part of expressing their views on how to make schools safer. And children have spoken with great authority about what they need to face the future, and it is our responsibility to respond by committing to this agenda and endorsing and fully implementing the declaration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the panelists who have really, I think, underlined the importance of recognizing the role of education in society, the role it should have in national policy, in the humanitarian response, and in the development cooperation.
Ms. Andersen,
we've been urged to use this.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, just very quickly, but we have one special question.
Oh, good.
And if we can just have a one-person answer, really brief answer would be wonderful. But I think yes, you'll want to listen to her. Please go ahead.
Absolutely.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maribel Nzakwe. I'm 16 years old. I'm in SS2 from Government Secondary School, Gariki, Area 10, Abuja. Listening to what all of you said, but I just want to ask one question, which says, how can you guys help to save school in Nigeria? And what can we, the students, do to save school in Nigeria and to also save ourselves? Not only in Nigeria, but in the whole world.
Thank you very much for that question. I think this is something really the whole panel would have liked to respond to. But Ms. Okpo, do you have a suggestion for who we could guide that question to?
Perhaps if you may, Cathrine, I would like to just respond to that question from the perspective of funding, of a global fund. I think what we've seen over the last couple of days in this conference is this incredible momentum and political will around the Safe Schools Declaration and around these national action plans. So I think the political will is there and it's growing. I think the call is and has been around the practical bit. And that you need fundamentally funding. And it's a great opportunity to sort of add my closing remarks, focus on that point. This idea of financing these national level Safe Schools Declaration action plans, having multi-year predictable financing for partners to be able to take these fantastic ideas, these innovative solutions, and put them into concrete actions. These partners on the ground, they have the capacity, they have the skills, they know what they're doing. What they need, what they lack, is the financing to be able to put it into action. And that's how I would respond to your excellent question. I think fundamentally is more money to fund these actions. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Graham. It was, I'm sorry for rushing at the end there and forgetting you in the summing up. But I think also the point that was made from the other speakers on participation of children and young people in the action plans and in the policy development is key. So hoping now that I have not forgotten or ignored anyone in concluding this panel, thank you so much. And I will hand the floor over to Ms. Okpo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Andersen. That I was engrossed. I think we could all have listened for another hour and just talked about this. And it's a beautiful thing to listen to education being discussed so practically and with such an awareness of the needs and the requirements for the young people themselves who we are doing all of this for. So I would like to thank you all for a really, really great conversation, and then just move us all into the tea break so that we can take a walk and just think about the really great conversations we've had. For our virtual audience, I am told that there is a virtual concert you can watch in the lobby of the SSD platform. It's the concert that we heard at the welcome organized by the university's Network for Children in Armed Conflict and the CPM Music Institute. And before we head out for our tea break, can we just give a really big round of applause for that panel? we will be right back here by 11:15 for our next conversation, Reflections on Protecting Education from Attack in the Sahel. I ask that you have a wonderful tea break, and I will see you back here by 11:15. Thank you.